Well, good morning and welcome to CSUN. First off, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. You're one of the few people that were able to make it out here, and I see we have a packed room. So, this morning, I wanted to kick off everything with the first session on document accessibility, infrastructure to avoid litigation. So, essentially, this topic had its genesis within looking at companies and organizations such as what has occurred in the state of Florida. So this morning, what we're going to learn about is the legal and why, what my organization needs to be aware of, what do I have to do, or what can I do, or even how to be proactive around this whole solution. So as we go through, feel free to ask me questions, and we'll try to take you through what we've learned and what we've observed over the past number of months. So when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about barriers. We're talking about how to provide solutions to individuals out there that may have a need, a visual disability. And for that matter, we can be chatting about things that are digital in nature, that are located on websites, and for that matter, even accommodations. When we talk about, the ADA in the United States or other bills that are in other countries, we're really talking about a civil rights act more than anything else. And as such, we really want to be considering how we can provide services so that we can be inclusive in a natural way, first of all, and also to provide those capabilities for those individuals to self and independently navigate information. So over the past number of months or so, while this is a civil rights activism, people out there have been doing what is called legal embezzlement, and we've seen that in the state of Florida, where individuals out there have sued or sent demand letters to over 210 municipalities, cities, and so on at this point in time. The average settlement has been approximately $20 to $25,000 per individual city. So, if you think about it, most cities aren't sitting around with additional budget to sort of pay for that. And as such, while they should have known about these requirements to ensure that their digital information, and for that matter, even some of their laws, like the Sunshine Law, uh, require them to have this accessible, they should have considered that making documents online is all part of their responsibility. So here's what's been happening. Like I said earlier, there's been over 210 demand letters that have been sent. We've seen a dramatic increase in demand letters as well as lawsuits that have occurred. In fact, I'll show you in the next few moments sort of the growth in this whole area. But as I said, legal embezzlement or legal extortion is the term that's being used because essentially it's one individual or two individuals that have been doing this across the state of Florida at this point in time. And of course, this is happening in many other states as well and many other provinces in Canada. So people are using the law at this point in time to aim at those individuals or organizations that have not sort of made their documents or their websites accessible. Some laws to consider, and I'll go by sort of the highest level law, the Americans Disability Act, or ADA for the USA. This is a really an anti-discrimination law, and really what comes into focus is Title III. And certainly, one law that's really pushing a lot is Section 508, especially the refresh that was done in 2018, requiring all documents and anything that is supplied to the U.S. government, which is probably the largest buyer of any goods and supplies. Um, they have to be made accessible for the government workers out there. So certainly there's a number of other specific laws that are very focused on providing information and making sure that those verticals are covered as well. So you want to be sure that you understand these various laws because the ADA, which is the highest level law, is the governing body law, but it only tells you more or less that this is a civil rights law. The other ones that are sort of a bit lower will tell you you must meet things like WCAG 2.0 AA at a minimum. You must provide accommodation like Braille, for example, and so on. So you want to be sure that you understand these so that you understand your responsibility. In Canada, same landscape as well. There are, at the highest level, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but most recently, the Accessible Canada Act came into play as well. A lot of people have heard about the law called AOTA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and this one has gone across the country to the various other provinces. Again, So, a lot of litigation and a lot of people are sort of moving around once again, trying to ensure that they get their fair share of their legal lawsuits out there as well. Now, as I said earlier, we can see here on this chart, and this is a Safe Arth and Shaw chart done by the Integer Group. It talks about web accessibility, and within web accessibility, of course, digital assets come into play. And when I talk about digital assets, we talk about things like PDFs. If those PDFs are not navigatable and not inclusive, then certainly it's very easy to launch a lawsuit at that point in time. Even in Canada, we're seeing individuals that are making careers of just doing that because an organization has not sort of set up or tagged the documents so that those legal documents that should be public in the public domain are not available. But if we look at 2015, and these ones are specifically to DOJ federal cases here. This is what the DOJ is doing. They're litigating against organizations out there that are not making things like websites inclusive and their content inclusive. And that has grown really from, a low number of 2013 of 2,700 to, well, statistically here in 2018, there was 10,165. But knowing what I know from the year 2019, that had actually doubled and surpassed over 20,000 cases in the year of 2019. And we don't see this ending because, at this point in time, there's a combination of plaintiffs that are looking for the right thing to do, as well as folks that are doing this legal extortion, if you will. So, I mean, here are some pieces of information over the past 10 years or so. I mean, there's a lot of organizations out there that have had double digit in the millions of dollars in terms of their lawsuits and so on. As such, most organizations, as I said earlier, probably don't have, for Target, $6 million just sitting around to do the work around their websites. It makes more sense to spend the money now as opposed to having some big gigantic lawsuit or settlement that's going to hit you in the future. And with that, individual states as well, such as in New York, they've set up settlements to a number of banks as well. So it's very important at this point in time that most organizations really look at what they have to do and really consider how they're going to deliver documents, whether digital, online, or within their own organization themselves, to be made fully accessible so that individuals that are accessing that information, or for that matter, individuals that are working for that organization, have that as an inclusive document. We also know with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, this has been ratified around the world, with the exception of the United States. But certainly, this is a piece of legislation that sort of pushes and says that organizations must ensure that they provide inclusive information, they provide inclusive abilities for a person who has a disability to work in an office. That could be everything from ramps to washrooms to elevators to office spaces themselves. But as we focus on documents, a document is a huge part of any organization, whether it be an electronic digital document or a physical paper document, or for that matter, you're communicating to an external client out there who's purchasing your services. So the laws are not disappearing. In fact, there's more and more litigation and more settlements in this area. So really, we want to talk about what are your goals. Your goals really are to provide an inclusive experience for anybody who's out there. And we're going to focus on those that are blind, partially sighted, or have a cognitive disability. Essentially, documents must be navigatable. They must be independently able to be consumed. And as such, there's a lot of documents out there, and you need to have a plan on how to get this done. And that really starts from the top level of any individual who's sort of building these documents. Um, but as we look at the typical landscape out there, here's what we see. We see organizations just simply saying, yeah, my documents aren't really compliant on the top left quadrant over here. We have organizations that are a little bit rogue and saying, I'm ignoring the issue. And of course, we have some organizations that just don't know that there are the ability to do high volumes of these documents into accessible formats. And finally, there are documents that are, organizations that have full compliance. They've got the right tools, they've got the right backing, they are an inclusive organization out there. So a lot of organizations kind of sit in some of those locations. Well, one of the traditional issues is that organizations don't necessarily have accessibility staff. And as you know, here within CSUN, we are all folks that are focused on accessibility. With that, documents may not have accessibility tags or are even accessible in any way, shape, or form. They're stored perhaps as scanned image, and that's probably leading to why people hate PDFs so much within the accessibility community. Um, just simple things like formatting documents poorly, not using a style sheet, not putting headers in, maybe building an entire document in Courier 10 and underlining things that are important. It really doesn't give enough information so that you can actually create an accessible document. So with that, you really want to consider how to deliver that within the infrastructure of your organization. So with that, you want to be sure that you're making content, educational content, HR content, published materials, and especially anything that is personal and confidential, like a visa statement or a credit card statement, a banking statement. That type of information should be easily navigable and easily consumable independently by the individual who's reading it. So, as such, there are some critical things that you want to consider. Training and accessibility. You want to look at the long term in terms of automating certain documents along the way. Quality assurance and quality control, which is really critical because, time and time again, I'm out there and we hear, yep, we've tagged our documents. And as I open those documents, they certainly are tagged, but I'm not sure what they're tagged for, perhaps. Maybe they're tagged for, metadata information for an archive, but not necessarily for accessibility. So there are certain requirements, and certainly WCAG 2.0 is the most minimum. We know that there are lawsuits starting in WCAG 2.1, and there are mobility lawsuits as well that are starting at this point in time. So you need to consider the landscape of your documents. One thing that I hear, and I'll be talking about this later on with Regions Bank, is how to create a culture of inclusion. That Nick's presentation is coming up tomorrow morning with Kathy Lovell, who will be talking about that. How do you start with a culture of inclusion? That means maybe you're working with management to ensure that everything that you do is inclusive. But more importantly, when we talk about documents, when you're authoring a document in Word, when you're creating a PDF, when you are posting a document to the website, when you are doing community outreach, accommodations, your call center, and so on, everything should be considered up front, and it should not really be an afterthought because one of the things that we've learned is that it costs approximately 10 times more to retrofit something that has already been made non-accessible into an accessible format. So, forget about the lawsuits and everything. Consider the fact that you're going to spend a heck of a lot of money, right, up front to make those documents accessible. So changing and making those policies and putting them in place is critical in the whole plan side of things. So as I said, build everything with accessibility in mind because it really is good for everyone. As we know, things like ramps and automatically opening doors and so on have been, invaluable to those that are, that are not have that do not have a disability. Organizations should consider budgeting for accessibility in terms of what they need to do because these are becoming table stakes. And certainly, as I said, you don't want to be sued or have a demand letter come at you. Simple things that we want to talk about as far as making success is concerned. I talked about that a moment ago, but organizations that are using MS Office, which is pretty ubiquitous across any business out there, they should be using style sheets. They should be using the accessibility features. They should be training for that as along the way. Those costs and the costs to create these things are low in relative perspective to those lawsuits that are out there. And certainly, we've been working with a lot of organizations out there to create those style sheets, train those users, and the training is obviously not very long. But as always, most organizations and most users out there may not have had a simple course on designing a PowerPoint presentation or MS Word, but that becomes of critical importance in terms of how you develop a document, how you tag information, just for a visual perspective and guidance. But any of those techniques can easily be translated into an accessibility requirement as well. So using things like headers, using things like paragraphs, using things like tables and how to set up the tables within a style sheet, or even a template for that matter, to reduce the total amount of post composition or post publishing work that has to be done is critical as well. Things that you need to implement. Really focus on the fact that training is important. Using tools not only like Office, but things like Adobe Acrobat, maybe even Foxit, how to build an acro form, how to build a fillable, accessible form. Those become critical because they're not cheap to do after the fact. A lot of organizations have large backlogs of documents that need to be remediated. So, a plan needs to be put into place for that area so that, the documents that are being presented are, are really what we call the low hanging fruit. Those ones are the ones that need to be made accessible immediately because they're going to be focused on as far as any litigation is concerned. One thing I would highly recommend is to have a accessibility policy in place and a plan. So that you are on the road towards that accessibility if indeed somebody does try to attack your organization out there, that you can point to the fact that you're working through it and you're going at it with commercially best efforts. Things like web monitoring tools, document monitoring tools that can look for organizational input so that, if somebody just uploads a document with no accessibility built in, they'll be able to find that along the way. Or for that matter, build the infrastructure so that you have gatekeepers along the way who would actually load and update a website. Make sure that you manage your preferences on the front side. One of the things that we hear over and over again is organizations have inbound calls from folks that are blind or partially sighted, and they're requesting things like Braille or large print. While those organizations have accessibility, the front line just doesn't know that these are available, and they generally answer the fact that, hey, we don't have that, and of course that starts a massive complaint along the way. One of the most critical things to do, as always, is make sure that you do quality assurance and quality control, that you are actually tagging those documents to full accessibility because, we hear time and time again organizations thinking that they have done it properly. It's not done properly. And, like I said, those individuals that are making a career out of this are asking questions like, well, why did you tag it that way? And they're actually getting some payout as a result of that whole thing. So as we move forward, we've always, over the past few years, website accessibility has really been in scope, and noting that 2.1 is coming up and so on. But more and more, we're seeing document accessibility being the new area that a lot of lawsuits are happening in as well. We're seeing mobile apps as a rising area as well. So if you do build a mobile app, make sure it is fully accessible. Use HTML5, accessible technologies, and so on. Make sure your portals, for example, are made accessible as well. You can certainly have automated tools now that can create documents on the fly and have them tagged on the fly. And certainly we're a company that does that for a lot of banks, insurers, and many other service providers out there. And make sure that you meet the accommodation requests as well, because an individual that reads Braille may not necessarily be able to use assistive technology, or is that it's really their only preference that they can have. And when I use the word preference, that's used quite loosely because a Braille reader is going to be a Braille reader. They're going to need Braille either electronically, or they're going to need it using accessible PDF directly to perhaps a Braille reader or a physical paper output. So don't ignore that as well as part of that requirement as well, especially when you're dealing with things that are personal and confidential. Prepare your documents, as I said, banks, telecom companies, and so on, credit providers, insurers, and so on. You have to make sure that you meet those reasonable requests out there. So when you look for a provider out there, make sure that they not only do websites, they can do digital documents, and they can also do accommodations into various formats, because any small opening can lead to some sort of a complaint or lawsuit or whatever the case may be. Braille, you should consider the fact that there are two types of Braille. There is contracted and uncontracted formats. You want to be sure that you meet those accommodation requests. When we talk about uncontracted formats, that would be just simple, every dot sort of tells a specific letter. And that's a small population. Contracted, which is grade 2, which was used namely as grade 2 in the past. Those ones are contracted, so it's like shorthand. People that are blind and read Braille will utilize contracted Braille. Large print, make sure you're formatting your documents properly. Large print is not, uh, expanding your documents by 150% using a photocopier because, if you look at this statement here on the screen, it's got a lot of information, a lot of columns and so on. Most people that have low vision have a problem navigating columns, and they certainly read left to right. And as a result, protect your family. Total usage is this much money, which makes no sense. So make sure you format to standards like this clear print standard that we're showing here. Audio, certainly, assistive technology is reading in audio or providing audio in things like CDs or MP3s or thumb drives is the new methodology. Make sure you have that available. And finally, digital formats, accessible PDF, accessible HTML5 are all critical as far as being able to deliver information that will meet the needs of screen readers. Things like refreshable braille displays and so on, so that a person can navigate that information that's on the screen. But as soon as they begin to open up a document like an accessible PDF or HTML5 document for that matter, they need to be tagged so that it's fully navigable as well. So as I talked about all that, I want to just take a break and sort of say, you really need to consider what type of solutions are available. There are technology solutions that can do millions of pages per second at this point in time and tag a document into accessible PDF. You also want to be sure that workflow allows you to go from maybe an accessible PDF to Braille, for example. Those solutions need to be scalable so that they can also go to things like large print, audio, e-text, HTML5, whatever the case may be. There are solutions now on the market that are available so that organizations can take advantage of both the service side of things or actually purchase the software and have it implemented in their stack out there. Digital solutions, obviously, when we talk about things like accessible PDF, accessible HTML, ebooks, EPUB formats, DAISY, and so on, those are all aimed at assistive technologies like JAWS, NVDA, and so on. Your policies are going to state exactly which formats that you're going to provide out there. It has to be reasonable. You have to be sure that you are providing that information, whether it be your website or your digital documents, in a format that these technologies can consume. Typically, here's what's happening these days. There are tools that are out there like um, auto tagging tools like our publisher tool. It ingests a PDF. It uses heuristic algorithms and AI to tag a document. And there's a cleanup factor afterwards whereby you use a tool like our Auto Accessibility Now Remediate that cleans it up, that fixes things like read order, tables, contrast, alt text, and so on to ensure that you achieve 100% compliance out there. There are online tools where people can upload documents as well, like our accessibilitynow.com. Using that technology that we just talked about a moment ago, organizations can, democratize the ability to have anybody upload a document, pay for it, and receive back a document that is fully tagged and accessible at this point as well. There are pitfalls, as always, so you need to always obviously do QC and QA. And as I always use this example, is it two people? Here's a photo of two people standing on a mountain, or is it two people on a mountain rolling down the mountain, or is it two people about to do the lover's leap and jump off the mountain? You never know. But you have to be sure that all text is done post remediation so that the information is correctly displayed. Complex tables, just another huge problematic thing. While things don't necessarily need to be designed in tables, we certainly know that people do design things and put things in tables. So here's a situation where you have tables within tables and columns and rows that manage multiple columns out there as well. Very hard to navigate, very hard to tag. Perhaps it would have been a better way to actually design this table and provide that information. Certainly, things like mathematical symbology has to be done, whether it be in Braille, like in Nemeth, or whatever the case may be. Similarly, also as alt text and information to provide to individuals out there that need to go through educational content or academic type information. And certainly, read order is the biggest thing that we look at this point in time because we've seen documents that pass checkers out there. However, you may be reading page 1 and then read a sidebar that goes over to page 60 and then comes back to page 5. You want to be sure that the logical reading order is correct and that you test for that as well. Contrast, as always, when we talk about individuals out there that have color blindness or contrast issues and so on, you want to be choosing the right contrast colors and so on, and that includes things like size of the fonts and so on. It has to be the contrast levels at a minimum 4.5 on the hex scale, as well as 3.5 for a large print. Scan text, as we talked about earlier on, PDFs that need to be OCR'd back into text so that it can be navigable and so that headers can be set along the way. And finally, fillable forms. This is a very expensive area, but certainly organizations are creating more and more forms online, acro forms, HTML fillable forms and so on, life cycle forms, AEM type forms and so on. They all need to be made fully accessible so that if indeed your organization is delivering everything digitally, those should be made accessible. And similarly, if you have to deliver a signature on the bottom, consider the fact that you need to have a signed signature that is navigable. You may want to use tools out there that have accessibility based, things like DocuSign or whatever the case may be. And finally, the other side of the business, when we move away from those static documents, but we're talking about high volume systematically generated documents. Everybody receives these in the mail on a day-to-day basis. These can include things like tax bills, checking, savings statements, your mortgage. It could include things like your credit card statement. These are obviously personal and confidential type products that are out there, and those need to be made accessible. But the good news with that is that high volume documents that are systematically generated can be easily made accessible. And we run virtually millions of these pages through our software, and they're literally produced in seconds to minutes. When we're talking about hundreds to millions of pages of production documents into accessible formats. So the interesting thing about that is, you use tools like this where you can tag and trigger on content. And as a result, you can either produce this in batch or produce it on the fly, where it's tagging the information as it grabs the variable data transaction statement through. It'll tag it and put the necessary navigation or metadata in there so that assistive technology can navigate through this properly. So finally, on the back end, you want to make sure that you test your documents. Much like we've known about, web accessibility, you want to test your environment as well. And one great example of bad testing was, most of since we're right now in the state of California, Conduent is under a massive lawsuit of over $66 million of cost to create a website that had no accessibility whatsoever. The whistleblower, who was a person who was blind, an advocate camper, was just trying to go online to book a website, and he quickly found out that the website had no accessibility, no tags, albeit the site was touted as being accessible. The state of California Parks and Reservations also found that that they had put out this RFP stating it had to be accessible, but unfortunately it was not made accessible. So stay tuned for a massive lawsuit in this space at this point in time. So as I say, don't leave testing to the end. You want to be sure that you're using electronic tools and you're using human testers as well, using assistive technologies and the hardware that is out there, because websites react differently. Different PDF readers react differently. Different assistive technologies are set up differently, especially within their preferences and so on. So what's even more critical, I believe, than full accessibility compliance is usability. I mean, if it's not usable, or it's, it could be compliant, and as I said earlier, the read order may be just out of whack, but as long as it's fully usable and that it can be consumed properly using assistive technology, usability and accessibility compliance go hand in hand. So, one of the things that we do as a commercial is that we focus on both transactional and static documents. Transactional being those systematically generated documents, and static documents being published documents. And we try to ensure that we meet all the requirements for both digital assets out there, making things that are digital content into fully accessible, and also still maintaining the fact that we know that there is an accommodation requirement for things like braille, large print, audio, and e-text. We carry a suite of products out there that essentially mitigate risk and cost and support all formats. That includes everything from the high volume side, transactional and publisher, to an online tool for uploading of documents to complete remediation. We also do a number of different services, from training as well as consultation and development of those applications for those tools that I just mentioned. There are tools like Remediate and Publisher that will take on static documents like books and documents that are published as a PDF, and quickly create auto tagging tools, or sorry, tag them very easily. And of course, beyond that, there are other tools that many organizations look into, like a dashboard to understand what has been done, an assessment, a validator to do site scanning, and also determine where all the PDFs are within a website on those URLs that are out there. So with that, I mean, it's really important to be timely and relevant, but using this platform, many of our customers are able to enter and engage with us at different areas with a full suite of products. They may have already had um, their own internal testing capability, or perhaps they have a project in mind. They can grow with us, or they can enter at any point along the way to ensure that they meet their accessibility requirements. So with that, really what Crawford Technologies is about is we are a software company that focuses on accessibility, content services, and enterprise output. We've been in the business for well over 25 years, and as such, we have had a lot of experience in these areas from both a software development perspective as well as a service center perspective, where organizations can send their documents to have them made accessible. With that, if you want to learn more about us, and I do want to thank you for your time today. I think we've gone through approximately a half an hour, so feel free to ask me any questions. Feel free to email me or reach out to me by phone. I do appreciate your time in this uncertain time that we have here, and thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great day, and let me know if you have any questions. Take care. Bye bye.